I'm not studying Spanish grammar anymore because I don't think it helps me to communicate with native Spanish speakers, which is one of my biggest goals as a language learner. And when I say study Spanish grammar, I mean more in the traditional sense of studying a Spanish grammar book all the time and just memorizing a lot of grammar rules and completing grammar exercises. I've realized over the past few years that these methods for learning Spanish grammar aren't the most effective for me. I always struggled with learning grammar in my Spanish classes in high school and in college. The grammar sections of my exams and quizzes and homework assignments were the sections where I got the most points off of. And it seemed like no matter how much I studied grammar, my grades were not improving and I was still very confused. Right after I graduated college, I went to Mexico for the first time, and that was my first time ever traveling to a Spanish-speaking country. I found it very challenging to communicate with the native Spanish speakers there. And then I started to learn Spanish on my own seriously, but I kept on running into the same problems with Spanish grammar. It was still very confusing no matter how much I was studying. I started to use a language exchange application called HelloTalk, and this is when I really started to communicate with native Spanish speakers really frequently. I was sending text messages to my language exchange partners, I was sending them voice recordings, and we would also have voice calls as well. Many of these interactions really stressed me out because I always second guessed myself when I was texting something or when I was trying to formulate just the most simplest sentences in Spanish. I was never sure of what I was communicating. It was very hard to remember all the grammar rules that I had been studying. After all this stress and doubting myself and being confused, I finally asked myself this big question. How come after studying all this Spanish grammar over the past few years is not helping me communicate with native Spanish speakers? Eventually, after a lot of reflection, I figured out why these methods for studying Spanish grammar weren't working for me. One of the main reasons was I didn't realize that the Spanish language can't be confined to just a Spanish grammar book or to a Spanish textbook that I would find in a bookstore. The Spanish language, including the grammar, is a lot more complex and a lot more diverse than what is just in a grammar textbook. For example, a Spanish textbook or a Spanish grammar book won't account for all of the variations of Spanish dialects, and there are quite a few of them. I remember the first time that I saw the phrase "pa mi" used in a reggaeton song. So I was very confused because I've never seen the word pop before. I learned in some Spanish-speaking countries, they cut off some of the words. So instead, in this case, of saying para, they're just going to say pa. Even though saying para and para mí would be the more textbook correct version of saying this instead of just saying pa mí. Now, these learning moments kept on happening the more that I communicated with native Spanish speakers and consumed content in Spanish. Another big learning moment I had is when I was watching a telenovela, and there was just one guy who was giving a speech to a big group. And then when he finished his speech, he ended it with "Estamos?" Now, at this moment, I was very confused because I was waiting for them to say something else. ¿Estamos qué? ¿Estamos what? ¿Estamos manejando? ¿Estamos de acuerdo? Or what exactly? Because you can't just say one word like that because it's not a complete sentence, right? But for this guy in the group that he was talking to, it was. The way native Spanish speakers communicate is not confined to a Spanish grammar book or to a Spanish textbook. I had to keep on telling myself this. Or I would just stay in this endless circle of confusion where I would hear a Spanish speaker say a specific sentence, or I would read it and then say to myself, well, that doesn't make any sense. That's not in my textbook. I didn't learn that grammar rule. This is why now I always say that 80% of the Spanish grammar that I do know comes from outside of a Spanish grammar textbook or a Spanish grammar book. I also realized that to be able to communicate in Spanish is a skill that I actually had to develop. So it wasn't like I could just study grammar for 500 hours, memorize all the rules, know the ins and outs of a textbook, and then I would be able to communicate with ease. I had to put in a lot of work and develop the skill. And in general, trying to communicate in Spanish while also trying to remember all the Spanish grammar rules that I have studied is not a very natural way to communicate. For example, throughout this video, I've been speaking English, which is my native language. And guess what I have not been doing? I haven't really been thinking about all of the English grammar rules that I learned in school. Neither do I really remember all of those rules that I learned. The same thing goes when I was communicating in Spanish. I had to stop thinking about all those rules all the time. I was texting a Spanish speaker, or I was sending them a voice recording, or I was actually speaking with them in person. And then I would start to think like, okay, I'm gonna use the word estar. So I would think just like a textbook like I have, or this grammar book that I have in my hand. Okay, estar is used to talk about where something on or someone is. Okay, with an adjective, when there has been a change in the condition, someone or something, or to suggest that there is something unexpected about them, etc., etc. Then, okay, how do I conjugate the verb? Let me go to the next page to figure out how I would conjugate the verb. Just imagine how long it takes to go through this whole process in my mind before I actually respond to a Spanish speaker. It's very rigid and not natural at all. So now I don't study Spanish in this way to be able to communicate with Spanish speakers. But I still learn a lot about Spanish grammar without ever opening my Spanish grammar book. I could spend all of 2024 reviewing all the Spanish grammar that I have learned up to now and learning new grammar rules and trying to memorize as many grammar rules as possible. But I know that it can only take me so far when it actually comes to communicating with native Spanish speakers. I should add that I'm not saying that I'm completely against a Spanish learner from learning Spanish grammar with a Spanish grammar book or a Spanish textbook. But I'm just talking right now about my personal experience with Spanish grammar and what I am clear about when it comes to reaching my goal of communicating better in the Spanish language. Now, I'm curious to know, how do you study Spanish grammar? Let me know in the comment section below. Now watch this next video to learn more about my Spanish learning journey.